Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. A recent article in the prestigious magazine Foreign Affairs by the highly acclaimed scholar on India-America relations Ashley Tellis says that America has made a bad bet on India. Quoting from the article, Mr. Tellis writes, "For 2 decades, Washington made an enormous bet that treating India as a key partner will help the United States in its geopolitical rivalry with China." Mr. Tellis says the presumption is that New Delhi will respond favorably when Washington calls in a favor during a regional crisis involving China. But Mr. Tellis believes Washington's expectations are misplaced. And he adds the Biden administration should recognize this reality rather than try and alter it. Joining me live from Washington to discuss his argument and its conclusion, as well as questions arising from both, is Ashley Tellis himself. Mr. Tellis, as I said in that introduction, in an article that you wrote for Foreign Affairs on the 1st of May, which is just 3 days ago, called America's Bad Bet on India, you say New Delhi, over the last 2 decades, has been courted by Washington, and you call that an enormous bet. You say the courting happened by treating India as a key partner in the belief that India will help the United States in its geopolitical rivalry with China. You say, and I'm quoting you, the presumption is that New Delhi will respond favorably when Washington calls in a favor during a regional crisis involving China. But you add, Washington's expectations are misplaced. Now, before we go into the details of your argument, and I'll come to that in a moment's time, am I right in saying that your intention is to awaken American opinion to a truth they either haven't seen or not fully recognized?
Well, that is certainly part of the intention, Karan, no doubt. But let me first start by thanking you for having me, in this conversation with you. You've put your finger on the heart of the issue. I wanted to remind folks here that the relationship with India is actually quite unique. It's a relationship between two countries with very different histories, very different capabilities. And the context in which this relationship developed, which was in the Bush years, later followed by the Obama years, is now very different from the context that we face today. Our intentions when we started building this partnership were to build up India and its capabilities in order to create a framework that would prevent Chinese assertiveness. There was no calculation at that point about expectations from India beyond just simply the growth of its own power. Now that world has passed us. We are now in an environment where China has become a very determined challenger to the United States. And so the circumstances are now pushing us in the direction where there are growing expectations of who we can rely on in the context of this confrontation. And I wanted to sort of alert my readers to the fact that even though the context has changed, we have to think about India differently for all the reasons that I've laid out in the article. And so,
Let's
yes,
then,
it was meant to be
at
a warning.
Let's then, at this point, Mr. Tellis, come to the argument you present. You say, and I'm quoting you, although China is clearly India's most intimidating adversary, New Delhi still seeks to avoid doing anything that results in an irrevocable rupture with Beijing. Indian policymakers are acutely conscious of the stark disparity in Chinese and Indian national power, which will not be corrected anytime soon. New Delhi's relative weakness compels it to avoid provoking Beijing, as joining a US led military campaign against China certainly would. In other words, what you're saying, and you're saying it politely, fear of China's response is restraining India, and it ensures that India will not, and again I'm quoting you, play a greater military role in containing China's growing power. It's fear of China and China's response because of that disparity in national power that restrains India, that constrains India.
I think that's right. I mean, of course, no one can foresee or forecast what India will actually do in the context of a US-China confrontation, especially a major US-China confrontation. I'm not talking of political disputations, but a real war on the ground or at sea. Nobody knows how India will respond in those circumstances. There are just too many imponderables for us to consider. But the default expectation is that India cannot be expected to join us in that confrontation, given the peculiar circumstances that India finds itself in, which is it's next door to China. It has serious problems with China already, and it does not have the capabilities to challenge China in ways that will make its own circumstances, more difficult. And so we need to have a certain degree of realism about India's circumstances and the limits to what we can expect of India in those circumstances.
You talk about realism, and I should point out to the audience that, in fact, in your article, you go one step further. You write, and again, I'm quoting you, the fundamental problem is that the United States and India have divergent ambitions. New Delhi desires American support in its own confrontation with China, while at the same time intending to shy away from any US China confrontation that does not directly affect its own equities. And this means, as you put it, India does not feel any obligation to support the United States in other global crises.
I think that is, common sense in my perspective, because you have two countries, the United States and India, with asymmetrical capabilities and asymmetrical interests. India is focused very much on building its own national power. It's focused on protecting its own security. It wants to sustain the preconditions for its own rise. It's completely understandable. For the United States, however, we want to maintain a certain conception of order in the broader Indo-Pacific. We want to protect our preeminence. We want to be able to protect allies to whom we have sworn to protect. And those are a different set of objectives. And while India can rely on the United States for support in its confrontation with China, the point I want to emphasize for my readers is that you cannot expect reciprocal Indian support automatically without qualifications if there is a US confrontation with China. And I think that is absolutely the baseline case that we need to start thinking about.
You say it's common sense, and in a sense it is. But also, and this is equally important, your argument suggests something very important about the character and nature of the India US relationship. Again, I'm quoting you. You write, India values cooperation with Washington for the tangible benefits it brings, but does not believe that it must in turn materially support the United States in any crisis. That suggests that India is taking, it's not giving back. How long can this sort of relationship continue before some people in Washington, the administration or Congress, start to push back?
Well, that is, I think, the question that has now been brought before us because of the change in circumstances. But it's not that the prevailing strategy has lost all life. This administration has made very conscious efforts to sustain a partnership with India without asking for much. My concern is that that will increasingly be under stress. It may not be under stress in the Biden era, but if US China confrontations intensify, and that is a long term challenge, right? It's a challenge that will be with us for several decades. I fear the question you ask is exactly the question I think about, which is there will be strong pressures in the United States to be asking of India things that we never thought were necessary to ask of before.
I get the feeling, particularly from that last answer you've just given me, that either the basis of the presently close India US relationship is changing, or it needs to change to reflect the new reality of today. And when that change happens, I presume it will focus greater attention on the differences rather than on the shared values and interests. At the moment, it's shared values and interests that both countries talk about. But when this basis changes, there'll be at least some talk, maybe more, about the differences as well.
And that could well be the case. But I think what we need to do in the interim is to make certain that we build a capacity in both countries to be able to manage those challenges when they come. I mean, I see the task before us as essentially creating conditions for changes in policy, both in New Delhi and in Washington, as circumstances permit. This doesn't mean that we are going to end up in estrangement or rivalry or conflict, but I'm open to the possibility that India will want to do more with the United States and for the United States. I mean, there is nothing in my argument that precludes that, because the only point I want to make in the piece is that today we should not expect India to be doing more than we expected when we started building up this relationship, because India has different interests. But its
Except
interests will change,
that
and I would welcome that change in interests if that's supportive of the United States.
you're right when you say that the point you're making is that we in America should not expect India to do more than what it would be willing to do when we started the relationship, i.e., 20 years ago. But the truth is, Washington is beginning to expect India to do more. And if India doesn't do more, then some of the focus, not all, some of the focus will also be on the differences between the two countries. And does that mean that the closeness we see today may not be the situation 2, 3 years down the road? I'm not saying they'll be estranged, but they may not be as close as they are today.
I mean, that is a possibility, but one can always take consolation from the fact that even as these differences are already emerging, right, as the expectations in the United States increase about what India ought to be doing for us, et cetera, we've found ways to manage that as we speak. I mean, I don't see, sort of unbearable pressure on India to do things that it would not like. What I fear is that those pressures may come, and I want to ward those off, because I don't think India is ready at the moment to make those changes in a way that some people here would like to see. And so that's the purpose of writing this piece at this point.
I'll come to some of the differences that are emerging and maybe in some quarters are starting to irk, perhaps even rankle. I'll come to that in a moment's time. But let me first ask you another question. Who in India, if anyone at all, is responsible for creating the unrealistic expectation in Washington that maybe India is now ready to do more? I take it that someone or something has been said that has led to that expectation. It's not entirely one that Washington has dreamt up on its own for no reason.
No, it's not a question of personalities. It's a question of circumstances. Circumstances have changed, and as a result, the expectations naturally will change. When we began the relationship, as I pointed out, we had a relatively placid uh, partnership with China. It was not under stress. And therefore, the question of what India would do for us was completely irrelevant. Because those circumstances have changed, the questions now arise as to who can the United States count on if there is, in fact, going to be a major confrontation with China. And so it's not a question of who said what to whom, because I think that can be a distraction. I think it is structural pressures that are pushing us to think of our relationships in new and different ways. And the
Okay.
simple example is actually Australia. Look at the relationship we had with Australia 20 years ago. Look at the relationship we have with Australia today. It's not because a single personality, either in Canberra or in Washington, decided that something must change. What forced the change was simply the character of the geopolitical environment. And both sides then took steps to respond to it. And I think
Okay.
something similar is likely to happen in the case of India as well.
Let's then pick up on that key interpretation that it's circumstances, changing circumstances, that is also creating expectations. And that expectation could either lead to a certain measure of disappointment or it could lead to fulfillment. We don't know which of the two it will be, but that question is hanging over the air. Against that background, let's come to some of the differences that are emerging and ask, how serious are they? Are they causing irritation, and are they causing a certain amount of disappointment? To begin with, you write, Washington has sought to strengthen India's standing within the liberal international order. Yet New Delhi sees things differently. It does not harbor any innate allegiance towards preserving the liberal international order. And quite obviously, that is a reference to India's repeated refusal to criticize Russia's invasion of Ukraine, including at two G20 meetings. And yet, and this is the paradox, and yet this country that refuses to criticize Russia for invading a sovereign democratic state boasts of being the world's largest democracy. And now our prime minister has started to claim that India is the mother of democracy. So my question is simple. How is this contradiction viewed in Washington? And is it starting to irk and irritate?
Well, I think it's a contradiction that people do not want to engage, certainly in any public forums, because it's a delicate issue. I expect that these discussions are held privately, but the fact that Washington has bent backwards not to make these disputes central to the public management of the partnership tells me something about how this administration still values India, despite whatever may be its disquiet. And
There's no doubt about that.
as long as the current cast of characters is in charge of policymaking in Washington, I expect that this policy will continue.
But the interesting thing is the phrase you used, the fact that Washington has bent backwards not to draw attention to these disputes and differences. It's a real effort on Washington's part to overlook this that has led to the fact it's not a problem. Had Washington not made that effort, it could have become a problem. And in that context, let me now ask you about how Washington views the huge increase in India's purchase of Russian oil ever since the Ukraine war began. It was under 1% of India's oil imports in February 2022. At the end of April, it was 42%. Secondly, as Indian newspapers themselves are saying, India is now the biggest exporter of refined Russian crude out of all the so called laundromat countries. Now, is this understood in Washington because India is a poor country that imports 85% of its oil and therefore needs cheap oil? Or is it viewed, as sometimes the Ukrainian foreign minister himself has said, as an attempt to economically benefit at the cost of the shared values and principles, which is the basis of the Indo US relationship? Which of the two is it?
Well, I think it is certainly first an acquiescence to some inescapable realities. And the inescapable reality at the end of the day is that there is still a European dependence on the Russian energy system. That is the consequence of decisions that were made by European countries who happen to be our allies over the last 20 years. And so the fact that India has now ended up in this odd position of being a supplier of refined energy products from as a result of greater imports from Russia is something that we have simply had to live with. And we do live with it. I mean, we don't like it, but we live with it because the alternative is going to be very costly consequences for energy security on the part of our own allies. And so this is one of the paradoxes of what interdependence created as a result of decisions made 20 years ago in Europe. It's simply an uncomfortable fact. We wish it were different, but we cannot change it without penalizing ourselves.
So if I understand you correctly, you're saying this paradox is something you have to live with, even if it's not acceptable, because if it didn't exist, Europe would be in dire straits. Europe
Absolutely.
needs that backdoor from India to bring in the oil that it can't import directly from Russia itself.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And again, this is one of those outcomes that has been produced by a set of circumstances which were created on a certain set of assumptions, right? The assumption was that Russia would not be a threat, that Russia would be the most efficient supplier of cheap energy to Europe. On these assumptions, Europe built energy dependencies. Now we are faced with the refutation of those assumptions. And so how do we deal with the challenges posed by that refutation in the near term? And India plays a role in this. And obviously, as I said, we don't like it. We wish it were different. But there is no alternative. And better India does this than someone else.
In other words, the Indian laundromat, to use that phrase that's become popular, is not just whitewashing Russian oil, it's also providing a necessary oil lifeline to Europe.
Absolutely.
You also write that the enormous bet on India, as you call it, involves Washington's decision to overlook India's democratic erosion. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that President Biden and Secretary of State Blinken don't talk about this erosion at all. But it's also equally true that the American media does, and it's doing so more frequently and it's doing so more forcefully. So how long will it be before the American government is forced to speak out by public opinion and your own media?
Well, the American media is free to say whatever it does, right? That's one of the great things about the American media, and we want to keep it that way. But I think governments have a sense of responsibility. They have to juggle multiple objectives that sometimes are in conflict. I want to make it quite clear that this administration is not insensitive, is not blind to the changes that are occurring inside India. I think they understand that all too well. But they've made a conscious decision that the relationship with India is far more important and ought not to be imperiled by reckless American official interventions on subjects that we may not be entirely able to shape or control. And so I think they've made the prudent decision to essentially raise concerns that they may have about democratic erosion with their counterparts privately and without making them subject to all the kind of histrionics that would come if they were aired in the public.
But Mr. Tellis, isn't that a danger? That every time President Biden or Secretary of State Blinken talk about shared values, and that's what they talk about all the time when they're standing either with Mr. Modi or Mr. Jaishankar, that the American press will begin to point out that on the subject of democracy, the subject of civil rights, the subject of treatment of journalists, the subject of treatment of Muslims in particular, those shared values are being breached by your friend and ally. And each time the American media raises that, won't it become increasingly awkward for the administration to sidestep and ignore it? And at some point, won't they be forced to start agreeing?
I don't know how the administration would respond when it comes to that. But I think they have simply chosen a certain path that they believe serves them well in the circumstances. And I
Okay.
don't see any undue pressures for deviation at this point.
Your article ends with what I think is advice for the Biden administration. You write, and I'm quoting you: the United States should certainly help India to the degree compatible with American interests, but it should harbor no illusion that its support, no matter how generous, will entice India to join any military coalition against China. And then pointedly you add, the Biden administration should recognize this reality rather than try to alter it. Is this reality being recognized in the White House?
I mean, I think certainly the senior US leadership recognizes it. I mean, I think, the president, his national security advisors, and people around him recognize this. I have no doubt about that. But, the US government is not a monad, it's a large, corporate establishment with different parts that have different expectations. And those expectations, obviously, are now changing because of those changing circumstances. And so, this piece was meant to simply caution uh, about excessive expectations on the part of those entities that seem to think because our relationship with India has so transformed, the expectations of India must be now similar to the expectations we have of other treaty allies. Um, and to my mind, if this serves as a cautionary reminder that India is different and that there is value in a partnership with India despite the difference, then I think the article will have served its purpose,
Yes.
including that melodramatic headline, which, I wish I had the wits to author.
Well, I have to tell you that melodramatic headline actually, in a nutshell, conveys what you were conveying in greater enlightened detail. Because I think the headline is very clever, but also very accurate. But if if realization is dawning in Washington that our expectations from this relationship are different, and the circumstances which have created new expectations in Washington, which didn't exist 20 years ago, may be unrealistic because India is not going to meet them, then that draws my attention once again to that quotation I read a moment ago. And let me repeat the opening sentence of that quotation. You say, the United States should certainly help India to the degree compatible with American interests. To the degree compatible with American interests. Has that condition been breached? Is America now doing more than its interests require it should do?
It's impossible to answer this question in the abstract. It will be answered empirically on an issue by issue basis. In the abstract, let me frame what I think the dilemma is in the abstract. We all have an interest in making certain that India is strong enough to stand up to China independently. That's one bookend. There's another bookend. We all have an interest in a strong India that not only stands up to China independently, but also works with us to confront the Chinese when required. That's an American interest. There is a delta between those two objectives. And that delta is really will become manifest on issues. And it'll be specific decisions that will have to be made on transfers of this technology or that technology, and so on and so forth. And I think it is in regard to those decisions that we will know how the United States judges what its interests to be. So I would say, at a minimum, we ought to continue uh, with the traditional objective of strengthening India against China, because that is in our interests. And then, based on whatever the specific issues are, you make a judgment about whether a favorable decision on that issue advances this objective, or whether you choose not to make a favorable decision because it does not satisfy the second objective, which is getting India to work in partnership with us in a China confrontation. And I think those
Absolutely.
are decisions we're going to see made in the here and now, in the months and years to come.
And the corollary to that is that as the realization increasingly dawns in Washington that India is not going to necessarily reciprocate in the way our circumstances have led us to expect and hope it will, that there will be issues on which Washington could end up disappointing India, that there will be issues on which Washington will say, it's really not in our interest to go that far. And that may come as a bit of surprise to Delhi.
Well, my own sense is that Indian policymakers have been, very astute and very realistic. And while I understand why they will push the envelope in terms of what they would want of the United States, they've always been, astute enough to recognize that if there are some things which are a bridge too far, it is a bridge too far. And you look for alternatives and you find ways of dealing with that.
Except, Mr. Tellis, you're expecting the Indian interlocutors to be more realistic about expectations than you think the American interlocutors are about theirs. If America has expectations that India can't meet, it's quite possible the opposite is true as well. There could be room here for a bit of disappointment on either side going forward.
Well, but that is the case with all international relationships, is it not? I mean, our allies have differences in attitudes with us, even on very important questions of how to deal with China. Why is India so different? You find ways of managing these things.
Yes, indeed. That is a very important last sentence. Accepting and understanding why India is so different is the critical basis on which closeness between the two can be maintained going forward. But if there is no understanding of that question, why is India so different, then the differences could become a little bit more irksome and worrying. I thank you for opening our eyes to an analysis that many in India had not thought of and had not encountered before. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much, Karan. It's a pleasure to be speaking with you again.
Thank you. Take care.
Thank you.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.